and somehow this camera has changed its purpose over time. And Sony cameras are often said to be just computers, but what if Sony continued making their cameras under Minolta brand? Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto and I'm a photographer. And I'd like you to meet my new favorite camera. This one here. This is the Sony a6700. But this video is not going to be a video where I'm going to explain how this is the best ever camera or the best camera anyone could ever buy. In this video I would like to talk about how a camera can transform itself or change its purpose after you purchase the camera. In this case, it's the Sony a6700, but it could be any other camera, any brand, any model. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you buy a camera, if you buy your first camera, maybe this does not apply, but even if you buy your first camera, you probably have some purpose for the camera. You plan to shoot certain things or certain subjects with the camera. But especially if you buy a second camera body or camera, in addition to your first one, you're also going to keep the first one. You probably have some plans for the second camera. Maybe you think that camera will be your street camera, or it will be your landscape camera, or it'll be your everyday carry camera or something else. But then after a while, after you've been using the camera for some time, you realize that you've actually been using that camera for something else than you originally planned when you bought the camera. Or maybe you used the camera for its original planned purpose, but you also use it for many other things. So over time, the camera sort of became something more or something else than you originally planned when you bought the camera. I originally bought this camera as a backup camera for my Sony a7 Mark IV that I'm using right now to film this video. I did not want to buy another full-frame Sony camera. They were out of my budget at the time because I knew I was going to travel soon. I thought I'd rather put my money on traveling than on an expensive camera body. However, I fully expected the Sony a7 Mark IV to still be my main camera, especially for photography. But now, after about 5 months of traveling, I left Finland in early November and I'm still on the road. I'm currently in Melbourne, Australia. Now, after about 5 months, I realized that I've been using this camera much more for everything, for both photography and for video, more than my Sony a7 Mark IV. And that has been a surprise for me, because that is something I did not expect. And somehow this camera has changed its purpose over time. And I'm wondering if this has ever happened to you. Have you ever bought a camera with a certain specific purpose in mind? And then after a while, after you've been using the camera for a while, you have realized that you've actually been using the camera for something completely different than you originally planned. Or maybe that camera almost replaced your main camera or your first camera. I've been trying to really hard figure out why I prefer this camera better than my a7 Mark IV. After all, the a7 Mark IV has a bigger sensor, better image quality, and it has a proper viewfinder, and it's a really good camera. And I've also been wondering, should I maybe get rid of the a7 Mark IV and get the a7C Mark II or a7CR instead? Because those two cameras, either one would be almost identical to this one, except that they have a full-frame sensor. Because I definitely want two cameras, one with a full-frame sensor and one with an APS-C sized sensor. Why two different sensor sizes? Well, I want to be able to use my full-frame lenses, my existing full-frame lenses on a full-frame camera body, of course, but I also want to be able to try out and test new full-frame lenses that are coming out all the time. And this may sound a little bit silly, but sometimes I want to shoot on a full-frame camera, but sometimes I also want to shoot on a crop sensor camera. I know it doesn't make much sense, but that's how it is. I just want to have some change sometimes, and that's why also two sensor sizes make sense. Anyway, back to the reasons why I think I like this more than the Sony a7 Mark IV. First of all, my shooting style has changed, and I hardly ever use viewfinder anymore, so the viewfinder doesn't really matter to me that much anymore. I want to have a viewfinder, but it doesn't have to be the best viewfinder or the most beautiful viewfinder, as long as there is a viewfinder. And also I like the exterior design. It's very like inconspicuous design that doesn't look expensive. Whenever I'm walking down the street, I don't like my camera to shout out loud that look at me, I'm an expensive camera. I like this kind of modest, almost rudimentary looking design. This is good, especially in black. The image stabilizer is also vastly improved over any previous Sony camera. It's still not up to the best competition like Panasonic, Olympus, but it's very good for a Sony stabilizer and is much better than, for example, my Sony a7 Mark IV in-body stabilizer. But the bottom line is that it's the size, weight and the form factor that make me like this camera more than my Sony a7 Mark IV. And you probably expect me to say something about the image quality, APS-C compared to full frame. But I'm not going to say much because the image quality is not any kind of an issue for me. Both cameras, this and the a7 Mark IV and all modern cameras, they have good enough image quality. Full frame has some advantages, and I especially like it because I grew up with film cameras, and the full frame, as we all know, it's the same size as the 35mm film frame. So in some ways the full frame camera behaves the same way as a 35mm camera, film camera. That's why I still like full frame cameras, but the image quality itself is not any kind of an issue for me. Anyway, back to the topic of the main topic of this video. A camera, any camera, not only this camera, any model, any brand can sort of transform itself over time if we give it a chance. And I think that's why we should not be too critical about any new camera or any camera we have never tried. For sure, we can't possibly test every camera or every camera model out there. And if we are already committed to a certain system, we are not going to buy another system, at least not very easily. However, I think we are very often too critical about a certain camera model or a certain camera system only based on the specifications or based on the fact that it has a wrong name written on it. But how do we actually know that this certain camera brand or camera model is so bad if we never gave it a proper chance? And a proper chance is not a 5-minute test quick test at the local camera store. A proper test or proper chance would be shooting on the camera for a few months and see what it can do. I just came up with an interesting thought. As we all know, Sony bought the remains of Minolta back in the day and started making Sony cameras. And Sony cameras are often said to be just computers instead of, for example, like Fuji cameras. Fuji cameras have a soul and they have emotions, and they are not computers. They are more like friends and not computers like Sony cameras. But what if Sony continued making their cameras under Minolta brand instead of Sony brand? How would we think about Sony cameras today if everything else was the same, except that these cameras would say Minolta on them instead of Sony? Let me know in the comments down below. This is all I have this time. If you enjoyed this, please do consider buying me a cup of coffee. There's a link down below for that. If you don't live in Finland, thank you so much for joining in, and I'll see you in the next one.